So now I will provide some commentary on today's reading as well as yesterday's reading. Beforehand, I will acknowledge that yesterday, before I did the reading, during the day, I engaged in many activities that would have been literal, practical, economic activities that I understood and believed would have been not only a part of what I considered to be my business endeavors, but also what I would have done in a responsible governance role. In another manner, I have described how at some point in time I understood that those that were operating in the name of the state, both the state of Texas as well as in the United States of America, were doing so outside of constitutional authority, and that insofar as their authority is derived from the people, that I, among the people, had a right to constitutional due process, and by completely refusing to provide me with my rights to due process, I also had a right to alter, abolish, or reform my government per the Texas Constitution, or alter or reform the government per the federal Constitution. I've been exercising that since. It's important to understand and appreciate the full spectrum of responsibilities that go into appropriate governance. It's one of the reasons I personally appreciate having the kind of relationship I do with Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis was a Supreme Court justice. He had an unconventional path to the bench of the highest court of the country, but I have not read any of his opinions. That is not the kind of relationship that I, at this point in time, have with somebody I would consider to be among the founding fathers of what would be my nation and my people. He and I have a different relationship, and so I'm respecting that, which is why I'm reading through this book chapter by chapter. And as I said, more recently, I decided to do so and record my readings as I read through them section by section through the chapters in the book as they are laid out, and then provide questions and commentary from that perspective. Yesterday, the section had to do with salesmanship and education. There were concurrent events going on, but as I have tried to say that I want to keep these particular kinds of conversational aspects and readings to be more general, I will acknowledge that insofar as he first identified the role of progressive media as being a form of education, I think this is a very valuable thing for us to consider, not only historically, but contemporarily. In the early 20th century, especially, the United States had a very, very active and thriving press in many municipalities. There were literally tens of thousands of even daily but also weekly publications in numerous languages in cities all over this country. A lot of this was a part of political organizing, but it was also a part of early basic education for people, including people who had recently immigrated to the United States. And many of the discussions had to do with some of the things that they experienced in their countries of origin versus what they experienced once they immigrated to the United States, and specifically how they provided for their means of self sufficiency or their means of taking care of themselves. And in the urban centers where there was a form of industry in which they could participate, even if they did not speak English, and then how they communicated with each other, including in the course of understanding that they had basic rights as workers and also as people, those kinds of organizing activities, and as well as some very basic education, was provided through the press. And it wasn't just the dailies that we know about today, the big papers that have been able to persist for a substantial amount of time, or, as has been discussed specifically in the United States, sort of corporatization of media outlets. At one point in my past, I was a journalist and a newspaper editor, and I met with somebody who was an editor at an esteemed publication in the city of Chicago. He had also been a foreign correspondent, and he told me something that was very profound. He said, in the early days of journalism, the concept of objectivity was significantly different than it is today. Now, this conversation happened in the late 1990s, but the point is that the understanding of objectivity has transformed over time, especially when it comes to the media and it comes to the role the media plays in public education. Originally, so far as I understand, the role of a journalist was not to present sterile facts in a sort of composite statement about the viability of a particular presentation of an issue or that which would be connected to the issue, including the entities involved or the actual production of those entities. That's something that's more along the lines of the modern manifestation of public relations, which was actually, so far as I can tell, at least in the United States, based on priorities that were set at the State Department level under the rubric of a presidential declaration that was kept classified for over 50 years. These are the distinctions, so far as I understand them, as reference points for the discussion and determination of the role the media plays in educating the people. And then once we discuss matters related to the role the media plays in educating the people, then we can talk about how do we access, how do we provide, how do we distribute, and then how do we regulate, including self-regulate, our commercial and merchant activities. And this is why the education, the kind of education, the quality of education, as well as the manners in which the provision of that education stimulates one to have their own connection with that which they are engaging. So important. And in a short segment that he provided as part of his writing yesterday, that was part of what was inherent in it, I believe. Part of what is the very concentrated wealth that he is sharing with the people in his analysis. And so this is part of what I think it was very important that he started that chapter by speaking about the role of the progressive media and then how the progressive media actually provided a foundation that could be better applied or employed by people like those that would be in government or even those that would be in a position to make decisions, including in the financial sector, that have impacts on people's lives. And whether or not those impacts are provided through the relationship with something like municipal bonds, for instance, or corporate securities, or whether it has to do with the processes of budgeting for a political subdivision, or the oft maligned but actually very important matters related to tax collection. And these are all the sorts of things that, at least in his recounting, I understand. He provides a reference point of understanding the role of media, and he says progressive media, with an understanding that the time period in which he was writing progressive was actually a identified political paradigm. It wasn't just an adjective. It was a movement. And so at this point, he was saying that he found there to be great wealth that was possible, including wealth in terms of means of educating people that could then be made available for circulation or recirculation with the hope that it would provide prosperity. And so the other matters relating to the structural mechanisms by which that is maintained and sustained are part of the manners in which he's contextualizing that. I personally appreciate that, and I think it's very relevant to what we're dealing with now. And one of the things we see very frequently now is the media as being in a mode of being accused of misrepresentations and or perhaps even having associated with it some sort of political leanings that are adjudged to not be appropriate by certain people who do not find they are satisfied with the reflection they are provided with through the media representation. This is one manner in which to see it. But as somebody who used to be in the media and somebody who is now in a situation where I am attempting to acquire more education myself, but also more active engagement with financial matters, and one of the things that is very important has to do with the production. The production of the actual content, as well as the manner in which it's communicated. Digital media has done a great deal, but then there are still just the core basic issues of authenticity in terms of identifying your sources. And then getting to the point of protecting your sources. And what does this mean? If you write an article and you put it into the public realm, and somebody is using your public notice as underwriting or evaluation in regards to what would be underwriting on some sort of security instrument, potentially, for instance, including a security instrument that is connected to or through or in association with an issue from a corporation that was referenced in that article. Well, it is not just the individual corporation that is impacted. It is all of the other people contextualized within that article. And so then we also get into the considerations regarding the intersection of the media with the legal realm. And I believe it may be one of the reasons why I personally have not gone beyond the early writings of Louis Brandeis, and I have not actually perused or read any of the opinions he wrote as a Supreme Court justice. At this point, it is as we are going through this educational process together. My understanding is when he wrote these in a serialized manner. They were segments that were published in a publication. This used to be a part of the media presentation in the United States, is that you would write something and it would put it into public circulation, and depending upon the frequency of the publication, you might have to wait a while. You get the article and you read it, and it's very exciting, and you know it's part of many articles, but how long are you going to have to wait for the next segment? You know, this brings up a variety of questions for me personally, but also in general consideration. When you start, for instance, a serialized writing project, do you know at the onset all of what you're going to say? These are personal, intimate questions, but they're also practical, and in some ways, by virtue of him putting this into the public realm through the publication, for circulation into the public through the media, he's inviting all of us to participate, even 100 years later. And so did he sit down and did he make a strategic outline where he said, I'm going to write this part, this part, this part, this part. Here's the timeline I have to work with. If he did he keep with it? In the course of going through the outline, did he at some point get new information, decide to adjust it? These are all very important questions that are part of not only what he's actually doing as a writer, providing public information on these topics so far as he understands, but also in connection with the fact that what he's writing, he knows. He knows that what he's writing is going to have an impact on what he's also trying to provide as education. And so the manner in which he does this, who and how he identifies what are priorities for consideration as part of the context, how much of that was strategically thought out at the onset, how much of that was stimulated by other things going on in the environment, so how much of it was him guiding the conversation, how much of it was him responding. And these are all very important matters that he ended up maturing with, and in many ways our country ended up maturing with and in connection with this sort of paradigm. And while we're reading Louis Brandeis at this point in time, in this period, like I said, there were thousands of publications in the United States, some of which did not have very large circulation. But the circulation of those publications was the primary education and primary community building for the people who read them. And this is something that is part of a great, amazing wealth the United States has, and we may not have invested as wisely as we could have. And this is one of the things I'm hoping to work through and with this on, and in regards to moving forward. As for the sections that were the section that was discussed today, specifically concerning, as he identifies it, the savings banks as customers, I'm going to acknowledge something. That while I was reading this section, something happened that had not happened before. And I believe what it is amortization. That while I'm reading this, usually when I read this, I'm very focused. I have a direct connection. In today's reading, I'm being amortized as I read it. And I know that. And so at some point in time in the future, we're going to have a more discussion on this concept of amortization. I will say, for the record, I did not consent. It's not to say that I wouldn't consent, but under circumstances such as these, I do not consent, and I would not approve you attempting to do such a thing to anybody else. It is 1:42 p.m. on March 16th, 2021.